Jeremy Francis, Cloudehill Gardens. 89 Alinda Monbulk Road, Alinda, right at the top of the Dandenongs. Now, this is where we begin our talks generally. This is the water garden. Presuming people want to know something of the history of the place, you can stand here and see the planting along the boundary, which is beeches planted as a windbreak, but partly because the beeches could be climbed and their foliage collected for fill-up material in flower arrangements. So we're looking at old plantings from the 1920s to 30s, nearly 100 years back, at a time when, the Great Depression, it was a commercial property, so not an inch of the space was wasted. Beneath the beaches, for instance, we have rhododendrons, but it's actually a hedge of the same variety. If you come in October, that hedge flowers with those rhododendrons, same variety, and growing rhododendrons as a hedge is a pretty unusual thing to do, but this was an old flower farm. Jim Woolrich was growing cutflowers and foliage for the florist trade, and so any plant put in to cut flowers was planted out as a hedge. There were quite substantial open areas where Jim was growing spring flowering bulbs for the florist trade. Bulbs which were cut for flowers each spring. The bulbs stayed in the ground, they multiplied. Over the last 60, 80 years, they have naturalised into bulb meadows, and all these we could incorporate into a garden. So when we began work here in 1992, we literally began work right here, excavating, carving a terrace across the old plantings, cleaning up many years worth of weeds as we went. But in 1992 we completed the first terrace and we were busy constructing retaining walls and planting hedges, and over the first 18 months or so we completed the first 4 or 5 garden rooms of what's now Cloudehill, and we've been busily expanding ever since. Standing here we have the pond beside us with a collection of ornamental aquatic grasses, the American oak leaf hydrangeas on each side, underneath hornbeam hedges, which are right in the process of being renovated at the moment. They're 25 years old. I planted the very first winter. Back to where we want them to be. Turning the other way, we're looking out over the first of our summer borders, the warm borders. These flower from late November, December, January, February. They literally are summer borders. They flower a little bit into March. You really need to come in the summer to see them. And this is quite unusual in an Australian garden. There's very few Australian gardens with elements which peak right in the middle of summer. But these are traditional summer borders made up of herbaceous plants which flower bursts through late November. We have the early season flowers flowering in December, the mid-seasons in January, late season perennials in February. So it's worthwhile coming 4 or 5 times to really appreciate quite what we're doing here. They flower in yellows, oranges and reds. There's a few shrubs providing some coppery and silver foliage, and the hedge to the left-hand side is copper beech. Copper beech, when it comes out, is a rich aubergine purple really, but it turns almost black with the shoots sitting out beyond this wall of black, almost crimson. So it's a very dramatic look for quite a period in early summer, midsummer, and so that's why we must have yellows, oranges and reds flowing out from this hedge, otherwise it wouldn't make any sense at all. From here the path leads through to the highlight of the gardens, Maple Court. The 2 big weeping maples in the centre of the gardens are significant for about 4 different reasons. They are 2 of the finest in the world, number 1. And they were 2 of the earliest of this particular variety in this part of the world. They're Acer palmatum dissectum atropurpureums. So they're the traditional old weeping Japanese maple. Beyond that, they actually came from Japan. And more than that, they actually came from a very, very famous Japanese nursery, Yokohama Trading Nursery, which was a Meiji period business set up by the Japanese government after after Japan was opened up by the Americans in the 1870s. One of a series of businesses set up to demonstrate that if Japan was going to trade with the rest of the world on a level that no one had ever seen before. And so the Yokohama Nursery is not a conventional, was never a conventional nursery. It was dealing with scientific institutions, with important gardens around the world, and somehow they were sending plants here as well, which was very exciting for us because we have a little collection of them, but especially these two weeping maples. They were planted, they were imported by Teddy Woolrich from Yokohama in 1928. They planted that season into the outskirts of the property and just used for propagation materials, so just tiny fragments of buds taken from the periphery of the canopy each season, so you would hardly notice the material taken away from the plants. So they, in effect, they were just left to grow in these beautiful conditions that we have for 80, 90 years, or 75 years to be precise, 75 years. And when we bought the property in 92, almost the first thing we did was to dig these two trees and move them here and construct the garden around them. I moved with about 2 tonnes of soil in each root ball. About 2 tonnes of soil. They were magnificent. They had to be huge root balls because they were pretty substantial when we moved them. And these are important plants, so there are about 2 weeks' work involved in digging each tree. And we used the same machine to move the trees that we used to construct this terrace. So it's a big earth-moving machine. There's actually a photograph of one of these trees sitting in the bucket of this dirty great drop running along the Linda Monbulk Road, causing a bit of a stir with passing traffic. The interesting thing is, since they've been here, 92, that's heading over 25 years now, they've more than quadrupled in size, I reckon. And which is a kind of an interesting thing for anyone who's had a go at growing a weeping Japanese maple, one of the lace-leaf maples. Generally people plant them in a little bit of shade, but we moved ours, which were in shade and amongst trees and rhododendrons, to full sun. Now, most of the garden is never watered, but these two trees, because they are so significant, we do occasionally water, and an average summer 3 or 4 times perhaps. 2009 was a horrible summer, very nasty and dangerous, and they were watered perhaps 8 or 10 times that year. And the rule is keep an eye on the weather, watch out for hot weather coming up, and give them a good drink before heat waves. If you've got something which can scorch on a hot day, there's no point in waiting to see if there's going to be some damage and then giving them some water. You've got to water beforehand. So these two trees, we do give them a good soak occasionally in the summer. Propagated around about 1920, so they're coming up 100 years old in about 2 years' time. If you go back to when the seed germinated, they're more likely to be about 500 to 1,000 years old. So they are the original old the purple form of the weeping Japanese maple. And that's a very ancient selection of this particular species. They're just building up autumn tints now. They generally go into orange crimson in the last few days of April, and because they have such big canopies, they tend to retain that colour a little bit over about 2 weeks. They drop their leaves at that point, and in fact, they're almost at their best in midwinter because their branch structure is the other feature of them, and you only see that in winter. You only really appreciate what an extraordinary branch structure they have. And my favourite photograph for these taken in the middle of winter with a little bit of snow sitting on the bare branches. The trees come into leaf in September, and the new foliage is a very dramatic crimson purple, It's very intense for the first 2 or 3 months, but in the second half of summer it softens, and then it darkens in a strange kind of way right in the last few days before they go flush into autumn colour, and as I said, they flush to an orange crimson, and that happens quite quickly. These are extraordinary trees to the point that I've had the head gardener of Sissinghurst standing here in front of these trees saying, to his knowledge, they outrank any plant in any English garden bar none. And then he went on to say that we have the best gardening conditions in the world and we should have the world's best gardens as well. And he went on to complain long and hard about the conditions they have at Sissinghurst. And if you know Sissinghurst, it is one of the most extraordinary places. But they do have 10 or 12 of the world's finest hands-on gardeners running around keeping it in trim. We have to manage, we have to get by, but we do have extraordinary soil, we have a glorious climate, we do have a lot going our way, and these two trees are a testament to that.